Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Andrew Johnson, Part 6, 17th President of the United States of America. We stopped last time in 1865. Andrew Johnson was the new vice president starting in early March, going into April. For President Lincoln, the beginning of President Lincoln's second term as president. On April 14th at 10:15 at night, Andrew Johnson learned that President Lincoln had been shot at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and he visited President Lincoln, who was dying. He only stayed a short time because it was considered unseemly. There was a death watch. People knew that the president was going to die, and it didn't seem right to have Johnson, his successor, sort of waiting for his death. President Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m., and Andrew Johnson took the oath of office as President of the United States between 10 and 11 a.m. at the Kirkwood House in Washington. And the oath was administered by Chief Justice Salmon Chase, who said, quote, "You are President. May God support, guide, and bless you in your arduous efforts." The new president, Andrew Johnson, asked that President Lincoln's cabinet remain for the time being. Mary Lincoln, who was now a widow, stayed in the White House for several weeks, and Andrew Johnson stayed away, gave her time for her to grieve and recover from this horrible loss. On April 18th, the Chicago Tribune newspaper wrote that President Lincoln had led the country out of Egypt and across the Red Sea of Civil War. Now, the Civil War was coming to an end. It was pretty much over, almost over, and the country was coming to terms with that. 1 in 4 Southern men of military age had been killed in the war. In 1866, the state of Mississippi spent 20% of its budget on artificial limbs for veterans who had lost either an arm or a leg or one or more of each. President Andrew Johnson had a low-key start to his presidency. He said that treason was a crime, this treason of Civil War, the secession of the South. It must be punished. William Seward, the Secretary of State, was ill. He had been wounded. At the same time, President Lincoln was killed. He only returned to duty in May and had a very strong influence on Andrew Johnson. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was controversial. He was devious, imperious, and disloyal. President Johnson trusted him early on. And now the issue after the war was suffrage or voting rights in the South, particularly for the new freed slaves, and President Johnson early on said that question should be decided by the states. So, very early on, Mary Lincoln continued to be prostrate at the White House. She was just in real bad shape emotionally, physically. President Johnson gave her time, waited several weeks. He did not come to the White House. He was working as president away. He was living in the Samuel Hooper home on 15th and 8th Streets. And then in late May, Mary Lincoln moved out of the White House, and Andrew Johnson moved in to the White House. His patience with her made a positive impression on the country. He had his office in the Treasury Department, or he had his office there, and Andrew Johnson was popular early on. In June, his wife Eliza and daughter Martha arrived at the White House. So the war was over. The radical Republicans wanted to protect the ex-slaves, the freedmen, and they wanted to control the South. They wanted to punish Confederate leaders, and they wanted to give land to the freed men. The first major crisis of Andrew Johnson's presidency, General William T. Sherman had an armistice or a peace agreement with Confederate General Joe Johnston, in which he recognized the existing state government in the South, state governments, guaranteeing property rights and universal amnesty. There was no talk about slavery and the rights of freed men, so this was unacceptable. President Johnson spoke to General Ulysses S. Grant to tell Sherman that his terms were unacceptable. Now, in the meantime, Secretary of State Stanton talked to the newspapers criticizing Sherman in public. So this became a public controversy, and General Sherman was angry that this was not kept private. So that was unfortunate. So this was a severe conflict between Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and General Sherman, one of the top Union generals. Ulysses S. Grant, the top Union general, said, quote, "It is infamous, after 4 years of such service as General Sherman has done, that he should be used like this." President Andrew Johnson, developed a friendship with William Tecumseh Sherman. President Johnson believed that Jefferson Davis was involved in the murder of President Lincoln. The public was angry that Confederate agents had been operating out of Canada. On May 10, 1865, Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, was captured, and he was put in jail at Fortress Monroe, Virginia. John Wilkes Booth, the man who was alleged to have killed President Lincoln, he himself was killed on April 26th in Virginia. His associates were arrested. There was a military trial, and there were several. They were all ruled guilty, and several were executed, including Mary Surratt. Radical Republicans wanted Robert E. Lee arrested, tried, and executed. The top Confederate general. Ulysses S. Grant opposed this. Grant came out and said that if Lee was arrested, Grant would resign. So that was good. And so Robert E. Lee never was arrested. On May 10th, as we said, Jefferson Davis was captured, transported by ship to Fortress Monroe, Virginia, named after former President James Monroe. One interesting anecdote about Andrew Johnson: he was a poor speller. He read a lot, but he did not spell well. And he said, quote, "It's a damn poor mind that can only think of one way to spell a word." Andrew Johnson enjoyed baseball. This was really the beginning of baseball becoming the national pastime. He enjoyed watching pickup games on the south grounds of the White House. And as I said, baseball was becoming America's favorite pastime. It had been growing in popularity before the Civil War, during the war, and then afterward. Andrew Johnson enjoyed, for fun, he enjoyed playing checkers, he enjoyed circuses and minstrel shows. So the war was over. There were stories of severe poverty in the South, which of course always happens when there's war. One of the major issues was Jefferson Davis. What should happen to him? Very controversial. Andrew Johnson wanted Southerners to embrace the idea of being Americans, not Confederates. Andrew Johnson, as president, his major task was to repair the broken country. Many folks believed that he needed to repay blacks in the Union Army who fought for freedom and for the Union, and that they deserved the right to vote. One of his biographers, Annette Gordon Reed, talked about Andrew Johnson's power, that he had, quote, the power to, quote, alter the Southern social system. Thaddeus Stevens, in the U.S. Senate, called Andrew Johnson, quote, a damn scoundrel. Annette Gordon Reed wrote about after the Civil War, quote, the United States had been broken and could not be put back together in precisely the same form as existed before. Annette Gordon Reed continues, quote, Andrew Johnson was faced with the Herculean task of putting things back together. It is always easier to destroy than to build. Andrew Johnson faced circumstances that were trickier to maneuver than Abraham Lincoln had faced. The high point of the Andrew Johnson administration came on May 22nd, 23rd, with the giant victory parade in Washington, D.C. Union troops of each Army Corps passed President Johnson, and who reviewed them. President Johnson saluted them. Meanwhile, the last of the Confederate troops had surrendered in Texas, so the Civil War was over. And President Andrew Johnson was popular, at least in May of 1865. The New York Times wrote about Andrew Johnson, called him, quote, a man of, quote, courage, of sound moral judgment, and of patriotism, and had stood the test of the most terrible trials. The Chicago Tribune wrote, quote, Abraham Lincoln gained immortality of fame by emancipating the Negro. Let President Andrew Johnson deserve eternal honor by using his power and influence in assuring the national salvation through enfranchisement. Andrew Johnson was always impeccably dressed. His fingernails were always cut, his boots shined, his hair coiffed. He was obsessed with cleanliness, stability, and order. He was the first president in the White House to have a comprehensive filing and storage system. Regarding his tailor work, he said, quote, My work never ripped or gave away. Biographer Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, The problem that would determine the failure or success of the Andrew Johnson administration was Reconstruction. How Southern states with the federal government, how relations between the Southern states and the federal government were normalized. The status of freedmen, whether they had voting rights and power. Now, the Republicans had dominated Congress during the war. With the Southern states back, this would bring increase the power of the Democratic Party. And before the war, the slaves, when it came to representation in Congress, which is based on population, they got one black slave or one African American slave only counted for 3/5 of a person. So now that they were free, they would count as 100% of a person, which would increase the population of the South with regards to representation in Congress. So you could see that what the Republicans were facing, a Democratic Party which would become powerful. The summer of 1865, the Raleigh Press wrote that the South was, quote, willing to acquiesce in whatever basis of reorganization the president would prescribe. Even black suffrage, quote, would be preferable to remaining unorganized and would be accepted by the people. In letters to President Johnson, he was urged, don't abandon the black people and Unionists of the South. Chief Justice Salmon Chase supported full citizenship for the freedmen. However, Andrew Johnson did not want to interfere with the suffrage of states in the South. He believed this should be decided by Southerners. He believed that if the federal government said that all the freedmen or male freedmen had the right to vote, this would violate state rights. And he also decided that he would restore the states of the South without Congress. This was called presidential Reconstruction. He believed that this, of course, it was debatable, and ultimately Congress disagreed with him. President Johnson offered amnesty to Confederates. So he went ahead with his presidential Reconstruction. The South was happy about his ideas, and the North was unhappy. Thaddeus Stevens, U.S. Senator, said, quote, Is it possible to devise any plan to arrest the government in its ruinous career? Is there no way to arrest the insane course of the president in Washington? At the end of June, radical Republicans who were on break came to Washington, D.C., asking President Johnson for a special session of Congress regarding Reconstruction. They were not happy with what he was doing. Andrew Johnson only demanded that the only demand he placed on the southern states to be readmitted to the Union was an emancipation amendment to state constitutions ending slavery. Andrew Johnson believed that he would be successful if he was popular in the South. He made an alliance with the old Southern leaders, causing a storm of controversy in the North. In the long run, the Southern states were kept out of Congress for a long time. Benjamin F. Hale of Georgia was a prisoner after the war. He had been a Confederate senator, and he wrote to President Johnson, and he said, quote, By this wise and noble statesmanship, you have become the benefactor of the Southern people in the hour of their direst extremity, and entitled yourself to the gratitude of those living and yet to live. Richard Taylor, the son of Zachary Taylor, former President Zachary Taylor, who had been a Confederate general, was thinking of emigrating, leaving the country. However, he was affected by Andrew Johnson's actions. He met President Johnson. They had an interview in the White House, which was positive. So at this time, Andrew Johnson was popular in the South. He had changed his the public opinion about him had changed. During the war, he was hated in the South, loved in the North. Now people were starting to dislike him in the North and love him in the South. The Democrats, his party, were happy. Republicans were not. On July 7th, the John Wilkes Booth conspirators were executed. Andrew Johnson proposed that the blacks could vote if they could read the Constitution, write their names, and owned real estate of $250 or more. However, the southern states were determined to not allow black people to vote. President Johnson supported the vote for black soldiers. He met a regiment of black soldiers at the White House, and he said that the United States was their country also, that black Americans had a good future in the United States, that through hard work and good morals they would succeed. There was news that Andrew Johnson's home in Greenville, Tennessee, had been used by black troops during the war. It had been used by the rebels earlier, and then there were reports that it was used by black soldiers as a rendezvous for black men and women. And Andrew Johnson said, quote, "It was bad enough to be taken by traitors and converted into a rebel hospital, but a Negro whorehouse is infinitely worse." President Andrew Johnson sent Carl Schurz to the South to make reports on what was going in the South, and Schurz reported that black people in the South were being treated with cruelty. Andrew Johnson reportedly wanted the South to return to pre-war conditions, in other words, end slavery, but not really have equality for black Americans. He seemed to lack sympathy for black Americans. Property had been given to the freedmen by the Union Army, and President Johnson supported the return of that property to its former owners. General Sherman had given land on the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to the freedmen, and Andrew Johnson believed that land should be returned to its original owners. Andrew Johnson wanted to give pardons to Confederates, restore rebel property. Andrew Johnson said that he was, quote, "was anxious to pursue a policy which would heal the wounds and repair the ravages of war, and bring those who had been in rebellion against the government back to their allegiance, and convert them into peaceable, law-abiding citizens." Really, the challenge is that the Southerners had lost the war. They felt bad about losing the war, but you had black slaves in the South, or now the freedmen, who celebrated that loss. So you could see there was really a major conflict in the South between European descent Americans and African descent Americans, especially when these black soldiers went home, and they considered they'd helped the South lose the war, and here they were going back to their homes in the South. Biographer Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, "Although Andrew Johnson thought that he would hold the principal Confederate leaders in suspense for some time, he was perfectly ready to begin a broad policy of forgiveness. He considered having a trial for Robert E. Lee for treason, but that did not happen. There was a flood of applications for pardon, which President Johnson granted. In October, leading members of the Confederacy were paroled." Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, "Whether Andrew Johnson really took great pleasure in responding favorably to pleas of haughty Southerners who had formerly despised him is debatable." Now, in the meantime, in the South, new laws were being written, the so-called black codes, which restricted blacks, which meant they were not going to have equal rights in the South. Vagrancy laws were passed to arrest idle freedmen who would be forced to work on government details, which was another form of slavery. Blacks were required to sign annual work contracts, and they had to present their work licenses on demand. So second-class citizenship was being established for African Americans in the South. Now, Reconstruction, this whole idea of how the southern states would be reorganized, or their relations with the government, what it ended up involving was a military government of the South, which lasted for 13 years, from 1865 to, something like that, anyway. And so during this time, one of the terms, Northerners who came south during the military occupation of the South were called carpetbaggers. and this was a derisive term, and Southern Unionists were called scalawags. Andrew Johnson pardoned the Confederate leaders. Northerners were upset. There were pardon brokers. This was a good business. Lucy Cobb was a pardon broker. She was notorious and had a dubious reputation and influence on President Johnson. President Johnson was troubled during the summer and fall of 1865. Of course, as we said, his family arrived in June. His wife, Eliza, was ill and couldn't really help. His daughter, Martha, served as the White House hostess. President Johnson wondered if the radical Republicans were concerned only about Southern blacks and not Southern whites, since there was so much economic hardships in the South created by the war. Speeches given by Thaddeus Stevens, Zachariah Chandler, and Charles Sumner, who were all wealthy, reminded Andrew Johnson of Confederate aristocrats. On December 2nd, Charles Sumner visited Andrew Johnson. Sumner said that the black people of the South were being insulted by rebels. So during this time, Andrew Johnson was pale, ill, and languid. He had a very tough schedule. He got up at 6 o'clock in the morning to read the newspapers. 8 o'clock a.m. he had breakfast. He was in his office from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., 5 p.m. dinner, and then he'd take a walk and carriage ride, and then have visitors from 9 to 11 p.m. before he'd go to bed. His son Robert was troubled and drinking heavily. Robert was working as his private secretary. Andrew Johnson's brother William was working as a surveyor in Velasco, Texas, and he was out hunting and had an accident, and he accidentally shot himself and died. So Andrew Johnson lost his brother William. Another tragedy, Andrew Johnson's friend Preston King, who was a good, honest man and whom President Johnson appointed as collector of the Port of New York. In November, Preston King committed suicide by jumping off the ferry in New York Harbor. He was overwhelmed by the corruption of his position in New York. Andrew Johnson was sad about the death of Preston King. One thing, so the way Andrew Johnson looked at it, he considered the greatness of the states versus the expansion of the federal government. And the federal government had an advantage in a power struggle with the states, so he really was interested in not increasing federal power. So the death of Preston King, as we said, was very tough. Who died in the Hudson River. Serious blow. He was a friend and ally. Now, in the South, there were provisional governors calling for conventions to abolish slavery and repeal the secession ordinances. And there were elections held for state officers. And the result that Confederate leaders were elected. As we said, they were passing black codes, slavery in a different name. South Carolina did vote to abolish slavery, but Mississippi did not. Andrew Johnson never promoted the right to vote for black people. And of course, the right to vote was really needed for full citizenship. Now, European descent Americans in North and South really were both against African Americans voting at that time. Lyman Trumbull supported the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was established to help the freed slaves who obviously needed help, since they had no property, they had no education, and they had this traumatic experience of being slaves. And Andrew Johnson, time and again, was against the Freedmen's Bureau, and every time it was up for extension, he would veto that extension. So as we said, in the South, they held elections. 4 Confederate generals were elected, 5 Confederate colonels. Alexander Stephens was elected to Congress. Radical Republicans were alarmed. In November, all of the southern states were reorganized except Texas. European descent Americans in the South did not want African descent Americans voting. From December of 1865 to July of 1866, Andrew Johnson ended up having a break with severe conflict with Congress and a complete break. Andrew Johnson was not interested in cooperating with moderate Republicans. It was kind of ironic. He had been a Democrat, but he was elected on the Republican ticket. You had the Republicans really had won the war, and you had a Republican president. The North won the war, and then after the war, shortly after President Lincoln was dead, then you had a Southern Democrat in the White House. So anyway, he ended up having a complete break with the Republican Party. He had promised to be the Moses for black Americans, but obviously he was not fulfilling that promise. He did not object that blacks in the South were being subordinated to whites. Now, the leaders of the radical Republicans were Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, Benjamin Wade, and Zachariah Chandler. In December, the radicals were ready for a showdown with Andrew Johnson. On December 2nd, Charles Sumner visited Andrew Johnson at the White House for a discussion. They had an argument regarding the black vote in the South. Andrew Johnson became excited and used Sumner's hat for a spittoon inadvertently. That did not help their argument. Again, Andrew Johnson believed that voting rights was a state matter. By December 19th, all states in the South except Mississippi had ratified an anti-slavery amendment. December 4th, the radical Republicans in Congress declared presidential Reconstruction null and void, and Congress refused to seat the newly elected Southern congressman. Thaddeus Stevens said that the Southern states were conquered provinces. 1865, the voters in Connecticut, Wisconsin, and Minnesota in the North defeated proposals for black voting. So you could see that European descent Americans in the North were against black voting in the North. Frederick Douglass visited President Johnson at the White House, and he talked about he wanted the right to vote for African descent Americans. And he said to President Johnson, quote, "You have the power to save or destroy us, to bless or blast us. I mean our whole race." For many Americans, the end of slavery did not mean full rights for black Americans. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau, this federal bureau, was created to go to the South to help black Americans, the freedmen, the freed slaves. There were 900 agents. The Freedmen's Bureau sold and rented confiscated lands in the South, and they helped establish schools and churches for the freedmen, for black Americans. Andrew Johnson considered himself a self-made man, and he expected Southern blacks to succeed without government help. He also had, poverty in his background, and he also felt apparently that there were black slaves who looked down on poor white people, and which people like to look down on other people regardless of their status. So that seemed to be part of his psychological makeup and resentment about that. On October 10th, 1865, President Andrew Johnson spoke to the 1st Regiment D.C. Colored Troops. These were Civil War soldiers from African American soldiers, and he said, quote, "You will soon be mustered out of the ranks. It is for you to establish the great fact that you are fit and qualified to be free. Here, freedom is not a mere idea, but something that exists in fact. Freedom is not the privilege to live in idleness. Liberty does not mean a resort to low saloons and other places of disreputable character. Freedom and liberty do not mean that people ought to live in licentiousness. Liberty means simply to be industrious, to be virtuous, and to be upright in all dealings and relations with men." On December 18th, Thaddeus Stevens gave a speech in the Senate attacking President Johnson's principles and demanded land for the freedmen. President Johnson's daughter, Martha, was a big help to him as White House hostess, and she said, quote, "We are plain people from the mountains of Tennessee. I trust too much will not be expected of us." Martha renovated the White House. She covered old carpets with pure linen, and she had brought newly cut flowers into the rooms. On January 1st, 1866, there was the New Year's Day reception at the White House. The White House looked good. President Johnson greeted the diplomatic corps, the Supreme Court, his cabinet, the senators, and the men in the House of Representatives. Andrew Johnson had pride in his family, except for his son Robert, who was drinking. Norman Judd wrote, quote, "There is too much whiskey in the White House, and harlots go into the private secretary's office unannounced in broad daylight. Now, the Democrats at this time were supporting Andrew Johnson. The Republicans opposed him. Andrew Johnson felt the need. He still was hoping for support from Republicans because that was the party that he had been elected vice president on, the party that had won the Civil War mostly. So, New Year's Day, 1866, he also greeted black well-wishers. He met P.B. Randolph, a freedman who wanted to raise money for Negro schools, for black schools in New Orleans, Louisiana. Andrew Johnson decided to send his son Robert on a mission to Asia and Africa, looking into abuses in the slave trade. Robert agreed. The papers were written. However, he changed his mind and did not go. Well, the major issue was the role of the Freedmen's Bureau, also civil rights for black Americans. Again, Andrew Johnson did not support black Americans voting. Frederick Douglass had come to the White House regarding the black vote, and again, Andrew Johnson was the psychological reason. He believed that blacks looked down on poor whites, and he had this poverty in his background. Andrew Johnson said, quote, "I know that damn Frederick Douglass. He would sooner cut a white man's throat than not." President Andrew Johnson would not sign the Freedmen's Bureau bill. He objected to the military enforcing black rights in the South, and he vetoed that bill. Congress was outraged. So this was the beginning of severe conflict with Congress, or what became ongoing conflict. And he decided to appeal directly to the people. He refused to support federal protection for the freedmen. His veto was overridden. Well, that concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time with part 7 about the fascinating, interesting life of Andrew Johnson. Thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.